Cuba, 1898. You are one of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders, taking a small break from marching through the Cuban jungle. The heat is almost unbearable, and many soldiers have fallen victim to heat stroke. Yet despite this, you're in a good mood. There is a hot, sullen beauty to the jungle, and finally, after all the delays, you've reached Cuba and will see some action. There is only one thing troubling you, and that is the cooing of the doves. You can't put your finger on it, but it's ringing warning bells in your head, like it isn't natural. Teddy is sitting near you when he suddenly starts. He has spotted something in the bush. You follow his gaze, and then you see the barbed wire has been strung up on either side of the trail you were using. He examines it and exclaims, "My God, this wire has been cut today!" You notice the cooing of the doves has suddenly stopped. That noise wasn't coming from birds. This is an ambush. A medic rides up noisily. Before you can silence him, his head explodes into a crimson mess. You frantically take cover as bullets fill the air, the screams of wounded and dying men in your ears. You're being picked off, yet you can't see the Spanish snipers to return fire. Where are they? You frantically look at Teddy, hoping he has a plan. Otherwise, you could all be doomed. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
Consequently, this country is at war with Germany.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
First few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Hello everyone. Welcome to part 2 of our series on the Spanish-American War. In this episode, we'll be covering the American invasion of Cuba and how it was nearly one of the greatest disasters in American history. Now, let's get into the good stuff. Let me introduce the general who would lead this expedition, a man I regard as probably the worst American general in history, William Rufus Shafter, also known by his nickname Pecos Bill in the Army. A legendary glutton and morbidly obese, by the time the war started he already weighed 300 pounds and was compared by the press to a walking tent when seen in profile. Unable to walk as far as a mile without collapsing from exhaustion, he also couldn't mount a horse. He would develop gout just before the campaign started and would be an invalid for the whole war. Added to this, he was also partial to large quantities of whiskey and seems to have been something of a functioning alcoholic. If his poor health wasn't enough, he was also one of the most disliked men in the US Army at the time. A loud, profane man, he was notorious for crippling the careers of officers he did not like and for holding epic grudges. Before the Spanish-American War, he was principally known for the infamous Flipper affair. Henry Flipper was the first African-American graduate of West Point and a former slave. After becoming his commanding officer, Shafter accused him of embezzlement of army funds. Flipper's fellow soldiers felt he'd been set up and raised enough money to replace the missing funds. Shafter still went ahead with a court-martial though, which, while finding Flipper innocent of stealing the funds, then went on to dismiss him from the army anyway on a last-minute additional charge submitted by guess who? Shafter. It's worth mentioning that the 2 white officers who had been convicted of embezzlement were not dismissed or dishonoured. This was the man expected to lead the largest American expedition since the Civil War. As usual, Teddy Roosevelt hit the nail on the head, claiming, not since the campaign of Crassus against the Parthians has there been so criminally incompetent a general as Shafter. To be fair to Shafter, the entire command structure for this war was not much better. The Army's commanding general, Nelson A. Miles, was notoriously vain and pompous, spending more time designing fancy uniforms for himself than actually managing the war. The Secretary of War, Russell Alger, was called by one associate the most egotistical man with whom I had come in contact. So it wasn't exactly a dream team. The opening move of the campaign was something of a farce. The Army tried to smuggle American advisors and arms to help the Cuban rebels. When I say smuggle, you are probably imagining a sleek, fast ship, dispatched in total secrecy. In fact, the exact opposite happened. An ancient steamer called the Gussie was chosen and steamed out of Key West, followed by 2 seagoing tugs chartered by American reporters who alerted the world that they were coming. To make matters worse, all 3 ships sailed with their lights blazing, ruling out any attempt at concealment. One naval officer remarked that, "What in Hades kind of lunatic asylum has gone adrift?" as he watched the supposedly secret convoy go past. Not surprisingly, the Spanish were waiting for the Americans. When the advisors came under fire as they landed, they abandoned the mission and fled back to the Gussie. However, her anchor was now stuck in the mud. To escape, they had to cut it off with an axe. The munitions and advisors remained undelivered. Not put off by the failure of the Gussie, America began assembling a vast army to invade Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. McKinley wanted to expand the regular army of professionals. However, he'd underestimated the lobbying power of the National Guard. Its allies condemned professional soldiers as little more than mercenaries, while guardsmen, and I quote here, "fight for the defense of home and country, for principle and glory, for liberty and the rights of man. They do not menace our liberties or the stability of our free American institutions." End quote. Noble words. However, the reality was rather more dismal. The Guard units were in no way ready to fight. They lacked uniforms, mess kits, tents, and modern weapons. They were also poorly led and poorly trained. Yet McKinley was forced to agree that 125,000 volunteers would be raised mostly from the National Guard, who would need equipping and lots of training, delaying the invasion. There were also some more bizarre offers of help. Buffalo Bill Cody said he could win the war by invading Cuba with 30,000 Indian braves. Jesse James's brother Frank volunteered to lead an army of cowboys, while one professor wanted to raise a regiment of female Amazons from West Africa and lead them into battle. I really have to wonder if the professor's motives were more of a personal nature. Unsurprisingly, these offers were all turned down. If you remember from the last episode, Teddy had left his cabinet role as Assistant Naval Secretary and volunteered to fight in Cuba. He was allowed to recruit his own regiment, a regiment that would go down in history as one of the most legendary and audible units ever to serve in the US Army, the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders were a weird mixture of American aristocracy from the Ivy League schools and the better clubs of New York and Boston, combined with grizzled cowboys and Native Americans of the American frontier. Typical of the first set were Woodbury Kane, a yacht dandy who fought with the same natural ease as he dressed, Joseph Sampson Stevens, the world's greatest polo player, and Bob Wren, a tennis champion of the United States. Also, much to my delight, I found out 2 of my fellow Englishmen, appropriately blue-blooded of course, also joined the Rough Riders. One of them insisted on carrying around a delicate walking stick, much mocked by the Westerners, in the belief that cavalrymen carried canes. Definitely officer material in the First World War there. For the Westerners, typical examples were the famous sheriff and gambler William Bucky O'Neill and Deadshot Jim Simpson. While the regiment was officially under Colonel Leonard Wood, in the public mind it was Teddy's regiment. This new American army was to be trained in the American Southwest, in areas such as San Antonio in Texas. The reasoning for this was that the hot desert climate would prepare the soldiers for Cuba's climate, seemingly ignoring the fact that humid, jungle-ridden Cuba was in no way similar. So, you have volunteers from around the whole country, many not in the best of health, all camping together, with no attention paid to basic hygiene measures. The inevitable happened, and disease ran rampant through the camps. Typhus and malaria broke out, with 20,700 out of 171,000 volunteers getting sick. Over 1,500 died, and they haven't even got to Cuba yet. In fact, that is a higher casualty rate than America would suffer through the whole war. Combined with rampant disease, the supply network broke down almost at once and food became scarce in the camps. The volunteer soldiers responded by escaping into town whenever they could, leading to frequent breakdowns in discipline. In a famous example, 2 Texan volunteers shot up a mirrored saloon in San Antonio. The owner was too terrified to press charges or ask for any damages. Teddy himself didn't help, rewarding an entire squadron to unlimited beer as a reward for improvement in their drilling. Inevitably, a fight started. As disease, starvation, and drunkenness plagued the volunteers, the newly minted warhawk President McKinley was bombarding Schaefer with increasingly ridiculous orders. He first of all demanded the entire army to be dispatched immediately, only to be told they couldn't do this as they were still in training. He then ordered that 70,000 soldiers be sent to Cuba, only to cancel the order when he found out that there was not actually enough ammunition in the United States to keep such an army firing for even 1 hour in battle. The landing force was now reduced to a mere 25,000. One of the great ironies of the volunteer army they created is that a large majority would never actually see combat or even leave the United States. Finally, the soldiers started heading to Florida to their staging post in Tampa. Let's pay a visit, shall we? You are one of Teddy's Rough Riders. So glad you finally reached Tampa. The train that brought you here stinks of vomit and horse manure. Surely Tampa will be better. As you march towards your encampment in the town outskirts, you begin to wonder if you are mistaken. Stinking mosquito-ridden swamps are everywhere, surrounding derelict shacks and sand drifts. In the middle of all this squalor is a weird sight that you at first think must be an illusion. But no, there's a huge, fancy-looking building with silver domes. What the hell is this? Teddy shouts from the front. That's the hotel General Schaefer and his staff are staying at. Apparently some madman built it out here in the swamps. As you march past, you see a huge, fat man with a big, droopy moustache sitting on the veranda. He is drinking whiskey and eating a steak dinner, while an annoyed-looking black soldier fans him. He is yelling at his staff and the soldiers in the street, slurring his words. This is complete chaos. Why has no one listened to my commands? Why is no one listening to your general? I should put you all on charges. As his staff try to calm him down, he turns and yells at the soldier fanning him. Fan harder, boy! Your general is sweating! The black soldier grits his teeth with an angry look in his eyes, barely increasing his languid fanning of the general. This is the man who has your lives in his hands, you think? The lack of organisation we saw in the training camps continued at the port of Tampa, which was entirely unsuited and unprepared for the military build-up. There was only a single railway line leading into the city, and no attempt was made to put anyone in charge of the railway traffic. The inevitable happened, and a huge jam occurred as train after train arrived with guns, horses and food. By May the 18th, 1,000 boxcars jammed the yards at Tampa, with only 2 or 3 being unloaded every day. No one had thought to communicate or label the contents of the boxcars either, adding to the chaos of the situation. General Miles reported that the officers are obliged to break open seals and hunt from car to car to ascertain whether they contain clothing, grain, balloon material, horse equipment, ammunition, siege guns, or commissary stores. Further adding to the chaos were the 2 private railroad companies who ran the line. As well as fighting over lucrative government contracts, they continued to send trains into town that had nothing to do with the war effort, including passenger trains full of tourists. Tampa was an absolute mess of confusion and chaos, while the ships meant to transport the soldiers sat empty in the harbour. Ordered to set sail immediately by an increasingly frustrated McKinley, Schaefer found that he only had room for 17,000 of the 25,000 troops who'd arrived so far. All the regular troops would go, such as the famous Buffalo Soldiers, African-American regiments who had played a major role in the Indian Wars, as well as the Rough Riders and a couple of volunteer infantry regiments. The rest of the volunteers were left behind at Tampa, ordered to return home by their own means. Really, I just love this. These men have been dragged all the way to Florida, only to be told to go home. While the Rough Riders were heading to Cuba, they had not completely escaped the cut. Only 560 out of the 1,060 riders were allowed to make the journey. Also, they were a cavalry regiment, Yet Schaefer decreed that only the officers' horses would be allowed on the transports. If the Rough Riders were going to charge into battle, it would be on foot. As befitting the chaos of the training camps and at Tampa, the journey to Cuba would also be something of a farce. Just before the fleet could sail, they were ordered to remain at the harbour due to an alleged sighting of a nearby Spanish fleet. Actually, the Spanish fleet was nowhere nearby. As they needed to be able to sail at a moment's notice, the soldiers could not be disembarked. Instead, for 6 days, the army baked in their steel ships. Garbage clogged the quayside canal until it festered and stank. The drinking water tanks turned brackish, while the army rations of supposedly fresh beef proved so disgusting when opened that they were mostly thrown overboard. Roosevelt complained in a letter that the men are down in the lower hold, which is unpleasantly suggestive of the Black Hole of Calcutta. I am really feeling sorry for these poor soldiers so far. Finally, the fleet was allowed to sail for Cuba. 819 officers and then 16,058 enlisted men, of which only 2,465 were volunteers. As I said, it's amazing how few of the volunteers ever made it to Cuba. Their original destination had been Havana. However, they had intelligence that the Spanish fleet was in Santiago Harbour. To Santiago they would be heading instead, to help the Navy destroy this fleet and win the war. As the enlisted men endured the stink of unwashed bodies and manure while eating disgusting rations, General Schaefer took an extraordinary gamble with their lives. The convoy struggled to stay together due to the mismatched ships of widely different speeds. Soon the formation was over 25 miles long, and they had lost touch with the vanguard for 14 hours. General Schaefer was terrified that they had been sunk, and the convoy halted until eventually all the ships were accounted for. Despite this, Schaefer still allowed each ship to be a blaze of lights every night, with bands playing and parties being held. If the Spanish had launched torpedo boats at the convoy, they could have done serious damage. I may well be talking about the great naval disaster of the Schaefer convoy. Luckily for the Americans, the Spanish never took the opportunity. Famous journalist Richard Davis, accompanying the army, remarked that God takes care of drunken men, sailors, and the United States. This expedition apparently relied on the probability that this saying would prove true. Finally, they reached Cuba and landed near the town of Daiquiri. Yes, that's where the name of the cocktail comes from. Before they'd even arrived, the army of volunteers had already been racked by disease and starved by their government's poor planning. Most of them were abandoned in Florida, as there were not enough ships, and they had then endured a hellish crossing and were extremely lucky the fleet wasn't destroyed by the Spanish. Surely things must get better, you may think, and you would be wrong. The landing quickly descended into chaos. Unable to work out how to transfer the horses and mules, they were thrown overboard so they could swim ashore. Hundreds drowned, and the sea became filled with bodies of horses and mules. Buglers on the shore frantically played tunes such as Boots and Saddles to encourage them to swim in the right direction. Teddy had brought 2 horses with him. Seeing the first drowned due to the same carelessness, he stormed over screaming curses and waving his pistol. The terrified sailors made sure the second horse safely made it to shore. The American plan was to capture the fishing port of Siboney, then fight their way over mountains and Spanish defences to capture Santiago. The Spanish commander, General Lieres, had heavily fortified the hills around Santiago, hoping that if he held off the Americans for a couple of weeks, then yellow fever and dysentery would destroy them. It was a race against time. The march to Siboney was a rude awakening for the Americans. 2 generals turned it into a race to get their respected troops to fight the first battle of the war. On one side was General Lawton, a tall man who'd served in the Union Army. On the other was General Fighting Joe Wheeler, a short man who was a former Confederate general and had been asked to join the campaign in Cuba by President McKinley personally, as an example of healing after the Civil War. Almost exact opposites of each other, they were determined to beat the other, leading to a battle that probably didn't need to be fought in the first place. Let's visit the troops marching to Siboney. You stagger forward, trying to focus on putting one foot in front of the other. The sun beats down mercilessly. It feels as though it's cooking you in your heavy military uniform. The combination of steep hills and unbearable heat is taking its toll on the army. The road is littered with abandoned blanket rolls, cans of food, and even underwear, as the exhausted soldiers can no longer carry them. Cuban peasants openly loot the discarded belongings before fading back into the jungle. Their men start collapsing with heat stroke, unable to go on. You pass so many that have dropped out of the march that you wonder if there'll be anyone left. When you volunteered to see action in Cuba, this is not what you were expecting. Maybe Spain should just keep this rotten island. As you wipe the sweat from your brow, you think longingly about taking a break, when you suddenly hear gunfire up ahead. Your tiredness forgotten, you charge forward. So many soldiers dropped out during the march that barely 500 were available for the Battle of Las Guasimas. We have now reached the scene at the start of the podcast. Used to guerrilla warfare, the Spanish had used dove calls to communicate the Americans' location before ambushing them. Caught on the back foot, the Americans were soon tied down. The Spanish were using Mauser smokeless rifles that didn't give away their positions, while most of the Americans had older rifles that emitted lots of black smoke when fired, immediately giving away their position. One by one, men began to scream as bullets hit them, or crumpled silently to the floor as the Spanish shots began to tell. Luckily, the reporter I mentioned earlier, Davis, was embedded with the Rough Riders and spotted the Spanish army's position. Let's head to the conclusion of this first clash of the war. This is a tight spot, you think, as bullets ricochet around you. Then you hear the fancy pants reporter behind you yell, "There they are, Colonel. Look over there. I can see their hats near that glade." Finally, you see them entrenched to your right. Your unit opens fire on the Spanish, and the jungle becomes aglow with fighting. Soon your shots begin to tell, and the Spanish leap up and race to their next hiding spot. You charge after them. The soldier next to you screams and falls to the floor, clutching his leg, and a bullet just misses your head, but still you pursue them as a running gun battle develops. They take refuge in their final line of fortifications, sniping at you from their trenches. The whizzing sound of Mauser bullets fill the air. Through your sights, you spot one breaking cover and about to shoot, but you fire first, and his head jerks back while his body falls silently to the floor. Then, joined by the rest of the army, you charge their trenches, and the Spanish break and flee. One last barrage of lead fires over your heads, and then quiet. They leave behind heaps of cartridge shells and they're dead. General Wheeler rides up excitedly, yelling, "We've got the damn Yankees on the run!" Despite the adrenaline running through your system, a chuckle escapes your lips. "Wrong war, General," you call after him. The scene with General Wheeler really happened. In the heat of battle, he tended to revert to old habits. The Americans had lost 17 men and 52 were wounded, while the Spanish had lost only 7 killed and 14 wounded. The Americans would claim victory as they held the field, but the Spanish had seen the battle as a delaying operation to cover their retreat to Santiago. Really, this was a small Spanish victory. While his troops fought the first battle of the war, General Schaefter's aides had only just worked out how to get the general on shore. As well as his usual ailments, he had developed an evil-looking rash on his head that he would demand his aides continuously scratch. The supply situation remained a complete mess, and barely any essentials were being landed, let alone reaching the soldiers. The Americans were effectively fighting on self-imposed starvation rations. Determined to find food for his men, Teddy heard a supply of beans had finally been landed on the beaches. Demanding some for his regiment, the commissar in charge refused because beans were only available to officers under military regulations. He hadn't reckoned with Teddy, however. Roosevelt walked out for a moment, returned, and demanded a huge amount of beans for the officers' mess. The bemused commissar, "But your officers can't eat 1,100 pounds of beans?" A smiling Teddy replied that, "You don't know what appetites my officers have. Now give me my beans." That night, happy Rough Riders cheered Teddy as they ate their beans. Whatever you say about Teddy, you have to admit, he had a great way of getting through bureaucracy. While the main expeditionary force was bloodied at the Battle of Las Guasimas, US Marines were attacking Guantanamo Bay. Yes, that Guantanamo Bay, which used to be on the news so much during the War on Terror for holding Al-Qaeda operatives. This is why America ends up owning it. Before the American declaration of war, the situation at Guantanamo Bay had been something of a stalemate between the rebels and the Spanish. The rebels could not take the town, but the Spanish controlled only the ground they stood on and could not leave their fortifications. When I say Marines, you're probably thinking they stormed the beaches in specialised transports, something like the island-hopping campaign of World War II. Well, put that image from your mind. It wouldn't be the Spanish-American War without gross incompetence. The Marines came ashore in small, unarmed boats, and had to disembark by standing in straight lines and waiting for their turn to get off one of the gangways that led down to the beach. Basically, they were perfect targets if the Spanish had tried to contest their landing. Yet no attack came. To make matters even worse, the captain of the ship who transported the Marines, the Panther, refused to allow his crew to help the Marines unload their ammunition. In fact, he also refused to release all of their ammunition, claiming he needed some of it for ship's ballast. So as well as disembarking their troops, all the while waiting for an attack, they're also having to unload their own ammunition and arguing with the captain. Such a bizarre situation. Luckily for them, still no attack came, though they could hear the Spanish in the jungle. What was going on? The reason was the Spanish were just as badly supplied as the Americans, if not more so. They hadn't received food supplies for months from Spain and were desperate. They were letting the Marines land and get established so they could seize their food supplies. In the absence of any Spanish attacks, the Marines began to get overconfident, and the mission took on something of a beach party atmosphere. When they were almost fully disembarked and the captain of the Panther had been ordered to hand over their ammunition, Spanish snipers opened fire on the Marines. Well hidden in the jungle and with their smokeless Mauser rifles, they were virtually invisible as they began picking off the Marines, who were hopelessly exposed on the beach. Spanish forces charged the Marines multiple times, only beaten back by primitive machine guns and naval artillery bombardments. One of the reasons I like studying the Spanish-American War is that events happened that seem like something out of a fever dream. What happened next is one of those events. The Marines were reinforced by 60 Cuban rebels, who for some reason had been issued US naval white sailor uniforms. The Marines are fighting for their lives. Then you have these Cuban rebels turn up wearing bright white uniforms that make them perfect targets for the Spanish. It must have been hell of a sight. As well as burning the jungle to drive out the Spanish snipers, they told the Americans to capture a nearby well, the only local source of water. If this was destroyed, the Spanish would be forced to retreat. It became a race between the Spanish forces and 2 understrength companies of Marines to seize the well. It became a running gun battle until the Marines came up with the idea of firing their 2 machine guns while running. This was actually quite an achievement. They were basically one step above those old Gatling guns you see in Western movies. While it seems they didn't hit any of the enemy, it was a novel enough manoeuvre that the Spanish gave up the race and retreated to one of their nearby blockhouses. The Marines requested that the nearby USS Dolphin shell the blockhouse, only for the ship to start shelling the Americans by mistake. There were no radios or anything yet to tell them to stop shelling their own side. It was entirely reliant on signals, something that was really hard to do when you're being shelled by your own side and shot at by the Spanish. In a desperate situation, a sergeant named John Quick came up with a bold plan. Let's visit this famous event. You hit the floor as a shell explodes near you. Dirt and rocks shower down on your fellow Marines. Those sailors are going to kill you all at this rate, you think, as Spanish bullets continue to whiz through the air as well. Someone needs to do something, or you are all going to be wiped out. Then you see Sergeant Quick. tying a blue polka dot neckerchief to a long stick. What is he doing? He runs to the top of the ridge and began signalling to the Dolphin to adjust its fire. The Spanish start aiming at him, and bullets ricochet around his location. Surely he will be hit soon. You pray that he will survive. His face is serene as he continues to signal, despite the bullets flying around him. Then the Dolphin messages back. The shells stop exploding on top of you and start hitting the Spanish blockhouse instead. He's done it! He rejoins the firing line unharmed. It's a miracle! For his bravery, Sergeant Quick would be awarded the Medal of Honor. The Spanish now retreated from the battlefield, though the well had been destroyed, so the American forces were now desperate for water and suffering from severe heat stroke. They would still have to wait 2 hours for fresh drinking water to be brought up from the beaches. 15 minutes of shelling would destroy the last Spanish fort in the bay, ending the action in this theatre of the war. However, America had once again had a lucky escape. The ships had sailed through a minefield, saved only by the fact that none of the mines had gone off. On later inspection, the mines were found to be faulty, plus a healthy growth of barnacles on the contact levers had stopped them from detonating. As I said, America is really lucky in this war. You probably noticed this episode has come out a bit early. That's because, as I experiment with this mini-series, I'm finding I can write the scripts quite quickly, so I think I'll be able to make this a weekly podcast while I'm doing a mini-series. In the next episode, the climax of the war in Cuba occurs as the Americans attack Santiago, and Teddy's Rough Riders will make their famous charge. Will the generalship finally improve? No, it will not. Join me next time for more Forgotten Wars.